No, I think you're fine for it, right? Great.
Or concern, because there's also items and things like that.
Right. Yeah, they had some of those too. It's just now.
Okay, welcome everyone. We appreciate you joining today. We have a little bit of background noise, so if you can put yourself on mute, that will be helpful for us as we get started. We'll give people a minute or so more to trickle in, and then we'll get started. Hope you're all doing well. Please sign in. Many of you already are, it looks like, in the chat. Give us your name and your LEA or school district. Kathy, I just saw your question in the chat about will this training cover CEIS as well as proportionate share? We are not discussing CEIS today, but the session we did on CEIS last month was recorded. And so I think, I don't have the link right off my hand, but Neil, has that been posted? Can we share the link to that recording?
It's working its way through USB to be posted as we speak. It should be posted shortly. Once it is posted, I'll email out to all of the participants.
Multiple half times.
Perfect. Thank you, Neil. And one other question in the chat about how long this meeting, the meeting is planned, the session is planned for 90 minutes.
Like it's washed. He said it's the insurance plan, like, but yet, you know,
There's some background noise.
Still got a little bit of background noise.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for joining. Thank you for signing in the chat. We appreciate you being here today, and we are excited to continue our series of engagements for LEA fiscal training related to IDEA and special education. We are excited to be here and have this training supported by USBE. Okay, is everyone seeing my slides now?
Yes, we are.
Yes, we are seeing.
Okay, perfect. So welcome everyone. This is a session on private school proportionate share and calculating proportionate share. It is designed for LEAs and for new or experienced both program and business administrators to build capacity. It will include a discussion of the proportionate share requirements under IDEA, a review of the calculation methodology, how much you should be spending on equitable services for students who are parentally placed in private schools. And we'll also help you to know about resources that are available. So we're really excited to be here today. This is, I think, our third monthly training we've been doing that USB
Rebecca's here
with WestEd to provide. We'll ask you to please go on mute if you're not already. Thank you. Anthony Makuna and I will be the presenters today. My name is Sarah Dutray and I live in Utah. I'm a former special education teacher in Utah and worked at the U.S. Department of Education doing monitoring of state compliance with IDEA before becoming a technical assistance provider. And I now work on national centers and also provide contracted technical assistance to states and LEAs, and USBE has reached out to us and developed some training sessions for you all. I am joined today by Anthony Makuna, my colleague, who is also at WestEd. Anthony is a CPA and was at the state of Idaho doing monitoring before he joined us at WestEd doing fiscal monitoring. So a lot of experience monitoring LEAs. So the goal is of these sessions to help you all understand the requirements proactively so we don't run into any monitoring findings. Our session objectives today specifically, and yes, we will share the slides and the recording from this meeting will be sent out. But our objectives for today are first to increase district and LEA capacity to meet fiscal requirements related to parentally placed private school children with disabilities, to increase the knowledge of the state specific requirements in this area, to demonstrate how to apply the proportionate share calculation with fidelity, make sure you're doing that accurately, to identify allowable and non-allowable expenditures for equitable services that are allowable expenditures for the proportionate share of funds, locate resources available to help you ensure compliance with equitable services under IDEA. Our agenda matches that pretty closely. We're going to first define what is proportionate share, who that applies to, talk about the Lea responsibilities, and then we'll get into the details of the proportionate share calculation, of the state-specific requirements, determining allowable costs. We'll talk through some common question and answers, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for you all to ask questions as well. We're going to start out like we like to on these sessions with a poll. And these polls help us gauge where you're at and gauge how well we do, because we'll ask a similar question at the end. But Anthony is going to put a poll up, and we would like you to rate your knowledge of the proportionate share requirements under IDEA. So tell us, how well do you understand them right now? Would you rate yourself very strong, strong, fair, weak? Okay, looks like I'm seeing, yeah. We've got about 2/3 of you have voted. Let's see, Anthony, it looks like the poll questions are slowing down. Okay, a couple more. Vote in the poll and let us know where you're at right now, your knowledge about the proportionate share requirements. Okay, Anthony, it looks like we've slowed down. Let's end it and share the results.
All right, we'll share the results.
Okay, so it looks like we have a great opportunity today to build some capacity. That most of the participants rank their knowledge about proportionate share as fair or weak, with just a few in the strong or very strong area. So we hope to see those change by the end of our session today, and get you to strong or weak. Hopefully strong, very strong, very strong. Hopefully we can move you, sorry, from weak to strong. Okay, thanks, Anthony. So before we learn about the proportionate share technicalities and requirements, I want to talk a little bit about what proportionate share is and why it's included in IDEA. Having this context for proportionate share will lay the foundation for the work. And we really believe that understanding the why behind proportionate share will help you implement the fiscal requirements better. So understanding why we have these requirements generally helps lead to better compliance in our experience. So let's start with looking at IDEA and the purpose of IDEA. IDEA is designed to improve educational outcomes for all children with disabilities. Therefore, it provides benefits and services to children with disabilities in public schools, and also has this requirement requiring school districts to make services and benefits available to children who are enrolled by their parents in non-public schools, so in private schools. They really are intentionally designed to improve outcomes for all children with disabilities. And it's important that we keep this at the forefront, because we need to understand that is the intention. The intention isn't to put additional funds in private schools. It really is about knowing the children with disabilities in our area and making sure they're receiving equitable service when that's available. Those children don't have all the rights of students with disabilities that attend public schools, but we do need to be aware of them and make sure that we're meeting the equitable services requirements. To understand this, we really need to understand who are parentally placed private school children with disabilities. This is going to be really important, because those are the kids who we're both counting to do our calculation and who are eligible, which is going to affect our allowable costs when we look at allowable costs. So under the IDEA Part B regulations, you'll see here, this is section 300.130, and it defines parentally placed private school children with disabilities as children with disabilities enrolled by their parents in a private nonprofit, including religious schools or facilities that meet the definition of elementary school or secondary school as outlined in state and federal regulations, excluding children with disabilities placed or referred by public agencies. So this is important for a few reasons. And there are a few things to consider here that are specific to Utah as well that may be different in a different state. That in Utah, our definition of elementary school does not include preschools. So children with disabilities ages 3 through 5 who are enrolled in a private school could be considered parentally placed if it did, but it doesn't. So if children are enrolled in a kindergarten in a private school, they are considered parentally placed students for purposes of these calculations. But because preschools are not included in our definition of elementary school, it's important to understand that they're not. The other piece that differs by state is that in some states, homeschooling is considered a private school. In Utah, a homeschool is not considered a private school. Our homeschools don't have to meet the requirements of a private school. And so homeschool students are not included in this, but you may see sometimes when you look at this, them included because in many states, homeschools are considered private schools. And so this would apply to homeschool students. So what is proportionate share? What is the share of our funds that has to go to these students? And I'm guessing proportionate share is more on your minds than it has been because there has been a lot of discussion about proportionate share for the ESSER funds and other recovery funds lately, but proportionate share is the portion of your funds. And in this case today, we are talking about your IDEA Part B grant. This is your flow through funds, Part B 611, that comes through to your district from the feds through the state to you. And a proportion of that sub-grant must be allocated to provide equitable services to children who are, to eligible students who are parentally placed in a private school within a district's geographic boundaries, regardless of where the students live. And I hope we don't see our numbers, our participant numbers drop right now significantly. But a really important thing about this is that when we look at private schools, often when we talk about IDEA and the district, the LEA pushing, placing a student in a private school, it's the LEA where the child lives that's responsible for that. For proportionate share, it is the LEA that has the geographic boundaries where the private school is. And so I see in the chat, I see in the chat, somebody's beating me to my punch here that because charter schools do not have geographic boundaries, charter schools do not have a responsibility to provide equitable services or to set aside a proportionate share of their funds for private schools. So this, like I said, I hope we don't all drop off now because I see we have quite a few of you that are from charter school LEAs. You should stay on just in case, maybe you'll move to a district at some point and administer this, but we appreciate you staying on, but this does not apply if you're a charter school because charter school LEAs do not have geographic boundaries. I don't believe any do. In Utah, I know we do, but I believe that's consistent throughout. So if you're a charter school, this is not going to apply to you. You don't have to do that. So yes, feel free to sign off at this point because if you're a charter school, this does not apply. So to ensure this provision of equitable services, to ensure that we know who those students with disabilities are that are attending private schools and that they receive equitable services, which we'll talk about. The number of each LEA is required to determine the number of parentally placed private school children so we can calculate the amount we need to spend. And the LEA's obligation is different for these parentally placed private school students, like I said, than if a school district decides to place a student in a private school. So if I am meeting with a student and the family and we decide this student cannot receive FAPE within our district, we're going to place the student in a private school, then the LEA is still responsible to provide FAPE to that student. For students with disabilities who are parentally placed by their parent, they are not entitled to FAPE. So this, like, if we think through what this means that I'm a parent, my child's enrolled in public school, they have an IEP, I say to you, gosh, I'm really not happy with the public school, I'm gonna move to a private school. You're probably gonna tell me, hey, you can't receive FAPE, we don't have to provide FAPE in a private school, but you still need to keep track of that student if they're an eligible student with a disability. And we need to make sure that they're counted as a parentally placed private school child. I see another question. chat. If a student decides to move from a charter to a private school, is it our responsibility to notify their geographic LEA? Oh, that's a great question, Ray. And it is not your legal responsibility. There is no requirement in IDEA that requires you to make that notification, but it would be really helpful probably to the local school district, because that LEA is required to do child find. We won't go into that too much today, but that LEA has to do child find and would be responsible for finding that student anyway. And eventually, hopefully they will find them, but it would be ideal if you did notify them so they could count them, because you do have to count them. So each LEA has to know, they have to do child find. Through that child find, they have to know the number of eligible children that are enrolled in the private schools in their geographic jurisdiction. They also have to calculate this proportionate share of funds that we're going to talk about today, the school age and preschool funds. And after consultation with the private school representatives and representatives of the parents of private school students, they have to use that proportionate share of funds on equitable services to parentally placed private school children. And we'll talk about a little bit more about what that means, but those students are not entitled to FAPE, like I said, and they're not entitled to equitable services anyway. So that meaningful consultation comes into play. We'll talk about that a little more when we get to allowable services, about what you might see or not see. But I want to quickly just do a recap of this. So each LEA, the requirement, each LEA, and I'll add in there our parenthetical, each LEA that has a geographic boundary or catchment must spend an equal proportion of the LEA's total subgrant under section 611 of the IDEA as the number of private school children with disabilities aged 3 through 21 who are enrolled by their parents. This is really important. Again, they're not enrolled by the school district. They're enrolled by their parents in private, including religious, elementary schools, and secondary schools, located in the school district served by the LEA, as compared to the total number of children with disabilities aged 3 through 21 in the jurisdiction of the LEA. So now we're going to test your knowledge a little bit. And I'm going to, everyone look at this slide, make sure you've thought about this. It's an equal proportion of your subgrant. And this is for age 3 to 21. But I'm going to give you a hint that the answers are similar on the next slide. So equal proportion, the total number of private school children enrolled by their parents located in the district served by the LEA and compared to all children. So let's think about for age 3 through 5, what that looks like. Each LEA must spend an what proportion? In the law, put in the chat if you know that word, or feel free to come off mute and say the word as well. This is probably the hardest one, Anthony, right? The first one, equal. Good job. Thank you, Rebecca. An equal proportion of the LEA's total subgrant. This is a tricky one because we're testing your knowledge of which ages the sections of IDEA apply to, but which subgrant is it if it's for children aged 3 to 5? Does anyone know that? Under section what of IDEA? It's preschool and age 3 to 5. Okay, section 619. Oh, good guess, Kim and Kathleen. Section 619 applies to 3 to 5-year-olds. Part C applies to birth to 3. So, and then 3 to 5 is part 619. So each LEA must spend an equal proportion of the LEA's total subgrant under section 619 as the number of private school children with disabilities aged 3 through 5 who are enrolled by their parents in a private, including, did anyone notice this detail? This is something that for some things we see this group of private schools excluded, but this is a characteristic of schools that for purposes of IDEA proportionate share are included. A private school, including good guess there with preschool. Yes, Janet's got it, including religious, elementary schools located in the geographic, I like that, geographic area. That probably is more accurate. We have located in the district, if that's the regulatory language, but the geographic area served by the LEA. As compared to, so this is talking about the comparison, we're comparing that number of students aged 3 through 5 with the blank number of children with disabilities. Okay, this one is total. It's the total number of children with disabilities aged 3 through 5. Okay, so this is, now you know the regulatory requirement. Hopefully, if someone asks you what proportionate share is, you have a good handle on what that requirement is. So the LEA responsibilities, again, we just want to go through these. These are going to be some programmatic and some fiscal, because again, these LEA responsibilities matter for proportionate share, and they matter for when we're looking at allowable costs, especially. So, and this came in the 1997 reauthorization is when this first was included in IDEA, and then the 2004 amendments of IDEA, that next reauthorization, the most recent one, expanded this even further. And I will say one of the reasons for focusing on this is that in the past several years, this has become a much stronger focus for the U.S. Department of Education in its monitoring activities. The Office of Non-Public Education has conducted several activities in states and with districts to ensure that students with disabilities in private schools are getting their equitable services. So the LEA responsibilities related to private schools in general. The first is that, like I said, each district has a responsibility for child find and determining equitable services. But that child find piece is important because you have a responsibility for child find, that's under IDEA, that is not considered equitable services. So when we talk about child find, the responsibility to potentially screen kids that are attending private schools, the responsibility to evaluate and determine eligibility for a student who's enrolled in a private school, that falls on the LEA, and that up until we know they're a student with a disability. So if we're just doing child find activities, and if we're doing an evaluation and determining eligibility, that is not equitable services, and we'll talk about that, but that's not an allowable cost of your proportionate share funds. That is just the LEA's responsibility. The LEA is responsible for child find. The LEA is also responsible for consulting with that private school. So as an LEA, you're responsible annually to have what the law calls meaningful consultation with any private school located in the boundaries of your LEA. And the requirements, we're not going to get too deep into that because yeah, go ahead.
Russian mechanical or Russian heating and air.
Sorry,
Yeah.
can you repeat that? I think that question might not be for us.
Yeah, I couldn't hear that.
Okay, perfect. If that was Jamie, if that question was for us, please unmute again and share the question or put it in the chat. That would be great. So this meaningful consultation, again, not a fiscal requirement necessarily, but it needs to happen every year. And part of that meaningful consultation as required by the law is that the LEA share with the private school the amount of proportionate share funds available. So the proportionate share funds are not obligated to specific schools based on the number of children enrolled there, but you do have to talk about the amount of proportionate share funds available. You might coordinate across private schools. You could even have maybe a meaningful consultation with with multiple schools at once, but that process, that consultation process of getting together, talking about how many funds are available for proportionate share, what the needs of students with disabilities are in the private schools, and what the equitable services will be, that's required annually. And sometimes one of the mistakes we find in school districts when we audit or monitor is that they've done that meaningful consultation once and decided with the private school that no services are needed, but they don't continue to have that meeting annually. We also find sometimes that the content of that meaningful consultation isn't as strong as it could be. And so if we verify with private schools within the district, they didn't understand what was allowed under proportionate share and what that really meant when they said they weren't interested. So it's important to make sure you do this in a very thorough way so private schools understand, especially if they are not going to receive equitable services. You then need to have a written affirmation of that consultation, especially putting down what you agree that the equitable services will be, or if there's a disagreement about that, that should also be documented. If you're unable to have a meaningful consultation with a private school, you should have a written affirmation and send evidence that you were unable to get it, and you need to submit that to the state. If you're able to have the consultation, you're not required to submit anything, but when you're not, you need to let the state know. Child find activities, we talked about that really quickly. Data collection requirements. This one is the requirement, again, to be aware of those students with disabilities that are in private schools within your district, located within your district when you do your child count in the fall. So when you submit your child count report, you need to include students with disabilities who are in private schools in that child count. They're reported in a separate category, and then the state reports them to OSEP. Then last but not least, this determination and provision of equitable services. And that's important. Again, equitable services are not an individual right. We do this calculation, we figure out an amount per child, but those services are not, they don't all go to one child. So that could look very different in different districts. That might look in one district like equitable services are just speech. That's what we decide we can provide with the proportionate share of funds available. And that's what we provide to private school students. And some may receive it. If students don't need speech, they may not get that, but they wouldn't receive another equitable service. So it happens often that these numbers aren't going to line up. You're going to have a number of students with disabilities that are eligible in private schools placed by their parents. And then a subset of those are going to be your students who receive these equitable services. They won't necessarily all receive services. For those that do receive equitable services, there is a requirement to have a service plan for those students that is similar to an IEP, but does not have all of the requirements of an IEP. That service plan may look different as well. You may use proportionate share funds for professional development. When you do that, the service plan may look different. Again, even fewer students may have a services plan. You have permission for delivery of services at the private schools by the LEAs. Those can be delivered at the private school or offsite. The most important one here is probably that proportionate share. That's what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about today, is that calculation and the allowable use of those funds. It's important to remember that, again, I've said this a couple times, this isn't an individual entitlement. No student with a disability in a private school is entitled to any services. So some of them may not receive services. And then there are complaint procedures that are separate from the parent complaint procedures for private school officials to complain to USBE if they feel these requirements are not being met. And now we're going to focus much more on the fiscal piece and on the determination of that amount of funds. So I'm going to turn it over to Anthony to walk us through the calculation.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Sarah, for giving us a good overview of all the requirements for LEA when it comes to private school proportionate share. So now let's talk about your fiscal requirements. The most important fiscal requirements in regards to your proportionate share. How do you calculate the amounts an LEA should make available to provide services to those students who are enrolled by their parents in a private school. So basically, after timely and meaningful consultation with a private school representative, then the LEA has to determine the number of students with disabilities that have been placed by their parents in private school to determine, how many of them are eligible to receive services. And then based on the number that is being collected, and in Utah, Neil, correct me if I'm wrong, the count is usually the count that is captured by on December 1st. That's the count that is being used to determine how much proportion should be made available to private school.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you very much. So when the number of students is known, so the proportion will just be calculated using how many students are in the LEA and then how many students are in the private school. And the funds made available will be used to provide services that have been agreed between the LEA and the private school representatives. And the next slide will just give you if you can move to the next slide. Yeah, this is pretty much the formula. You take your total allocation. So if you receive your IDE allocation, so you take the total allocation and you divide that allocation by the total number of students with disabilities in your LEA. And that would include students in your public school and students in private school. So when you divide that, then you will have an amount per students, allocation per students, and then you will multiply that by the number of students in the private school. So when you multiply the per student amount by the number of students that have been placed by their parents in private school, then the LEA will now determine the amount of the proportionate share of the LEA allocation that should be made available to provide services to those students that have been placed by their parents in private school. Simple formula. And then just now we'll go to the next poll question to see if you're paying attention to the formula. So are you seeing the poll? I hope you are. So this is the question. The formula for determining proportionate share of the LEA sub-grant is based on 1, the LEA total number of eligible parentally placed children with disabilities attending private school located in the district jurisdiction, or the total number of served students in the district. So the biggest difference here, which number are we going to use in the formula? Are we using the number of students that are eligible, or are we using the number of children that have been served? And please, if you can drop in the chats the reason why you think one or the other is right or wrong. We would like to hear your thought. Or also feel free to unmute. So far, we only have 25% of participants that have voted. People are being shy. There's no grading here. So we'll give it a few more seconds. Okay. So I'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results. Sarah, what do you think? We still have more people voting now. Okay, I'll end the poll and share the results. So we have 67% of respondents that think we are using the number of students who are eligible, and 33% think we are using the number of students served in the formula to determine private school proportionate share. And the correct answer is A, eligible. So when you do your consultation with the private school, those students that have been determined to be eligible to receive services is the number that you will use in the calculation, even if you ended up serving less than the number of students that were potentially eligible. But for calculation purpose, that's the number you should use. Do you have any questions?
Attending a conference, but it's just like.
Do you have a question or no? If you can please unmute, unless you have a question, you can mute yourself. All right, thank you. All right, so now we'll go over some scenario here to give you the opportunity to practice more how to calculate proportionate share. And if you go to the next slide, we have a scenario here. Awesomeness School District has determined through child find and meaningful consultation that there are 20 parentally placed children with disabilities ages 3 to 21 in a private and elementary school located within its jurisdiction. This fiscal year, the district was allocated $500,000 of IDEA Part B 611 allocation, which is the 3 to 21 grants. And the district also has a child count of 450 eligible students. If you go back to the question earlier, eligible students. So how are you going to calculate private school proportionate share for this specific example? If you can click one more time, Sarah. So 500,000 is the total allocation. And then what is the number that the LEA should use to divide this allocation by? Before Sarah click, I want you to drop in the chat. What do you think based on the scenario that is being provided? Okay, Ray say 470, and that is correct. And why is 470? Can you tell us why in the chat? Okay. So the answer is simple. 470 is because you take the 450 eligible children with disabilities of the district plus the 20 in private school. Oh yeah, she got it right. Good job, good job. And then when you divide the allocation by that number, then you get the per student amount, which will be, if we click one more time, Sarah, $1,063.83. And then you get that amount, you multiply that amount by what? We can give it a try again. We're testing the formula and see how well you listened. What number should we multiply this per student amount by? Use the chat or unmute yourself if you can, please. We're being shy, I think. Okay, I'll go. So this number will be multiplied by the number of students in a private school, which is 20. And this will equal to 21,276. That will be the private school proportionate share that an LEA should must make available for students enrolled by their parents in private school based on this allocation. We have another scenario. Now that you've seen me doing it, I really want you to do it. if someone can volunteer to give us answer through chat or unmute themselves, that would be super helpful. So scenario number 2.
We'll do
Sunny
that.
Beach.
Tough calculations for you. Just tell us which numbers to plug in first when we're looking at that total allocation.
Okay.
Sorry, Anthony, go ahead. But
So yeah, if someone can tell us, okay, 270. Why 270? Can you tell us why do you think 270? Sorry for putting you on spot. Private school and district students. Yeah, that's right. But if you go back and read the scenario, we have, all right.
good job.
Someone got it right.
Divided by 2.
60.
Yep, somebody brought forward the 20 from last time. We got a bunch of them now. Great.
Yep.
250 divided by 260 gives us
And multiply by 10.
multiply by 10.
Yep. So Kelsey got it. Now, I'm just so glad that more people were able to engage. That means, I mean, you learned something from the previous scenario. Good job, guys. All right. The third scenario, this one now will be for your 619 allocation. Sunny Beach School District has determined through child find and meaningful consultation that there are 5 parentally placed eligible children with disabilities aged 3 to 5 in private elementary and secondary school. This fiscal year, 611 allocation is 150,000, and a total of 80 eligible children with disability in public school.
Yeah.
How?
So Anthony, oh,
Yeah, go
sorry.
ahead.
I just want to make one clarification here, because what we talked about in Utah, that the definition of an elementary school starts at kindergarten. Those children age 3 to 5, their age doesn't necessarily matter, but those 5 children, we're going to assume they're all in kindergarten. So they are enrolled, they're in the age group for us. And then to meet that second part there, that they are in a private elementary and secondary school, we're going to assume they're in kindergarten. So there may be other students, if that private school has a preschool or some sort of pre-K, there may be other students with disabilities that attend, but they would not be counted because they're not enrolled in an elementary school. So it's a bit of a disconnect, because the 80, that total eligible children in the public school within your district, is going to include those 3 and 4-year-olds in preschool. But when we pull the numbers from the private schools, because only kindergarten counts under the definition of elementary school, we're making the assumption that those 5 kids are probably age 5 and enrolled in kindergarten. So just so that's, I want to make sure we reiterate that, because there is a disconnect there between what you would count given the definition of elementary school in Utah.
Thank you so much for that clarification. And then that's really helpful, especially in the context of Utah. So with that being said, let's just assume that, you know, these are all students in kindergarten. Now that we have the numbers, and I saw some people, I mean, did a really good job in the previous scenario. So let's go. What is the first number we should use? Like for the allocation. So, okay.
Oh, look at that.
Oh, wow. I'm impressed.
Yeah.
I'm really impressed. I think Kelsey already gave us like the final answers. I mean, she was already doing all the calculations. Maybe she should just take my spot and start training the rest of the crew.
Now you know who to call at USBE, Kelsey, when you need to double check your calculation.
All right. So yeah.
So we have like people, 85, yeah.
Yep. So this will be divided by 85 because you combine public and private school enrollments per student amount times the number of students in private school. And this will give you, if you can click one more time, the proportionate share of the 619 allocation that the LEA must make available for the provision of services to children of that age group. So this was just a quick practice for you to just understand the process of calculating the share of the private school from your IDE allocation, 611 and 619. Unless you have any more questions, we'll move on and talk about specific state requirements. If you go to the next slide. Any question about this calculation, or was it clear? And you can ask on the chat if you do, or unmute yourself. If not, then Sarah, we can move to the next slide.
Okay.
All right, now let's talk about the state-specific requirements. So, and we have Neil here on the call, so that's pretty much his baby. We'll talk about what is expected from you by the Utah State Board of Education. If we go to the next slide. First of all, how do you find out if you have private school within your boundaries as an LEA? And as Sarah mentioned earlier in the presentation, IDA rely a lot on state's definition to define, the criteria that makes a school a private school. And under Utah Administrative Code R277-4-426, a private school or non-public school means a school which is, and this is the language that came from the codes. The school is owned and operated by an individual, a religious institution, partnership, or a corporation. School that is supported by non-public funds primarily, and vests the operation and determination of its program with other publicly elected, with other than publicly elected official or appointed official. And also the school teaches the required subjects on each grade level as designated by the board for the same length as students must be taught in the public school. The school is properly licensed if required by the appropriate governmental jurisdiction, and also a school that complies with any state's local ordinance codes pertaining to the operation of that type of facility or institution, and also possess a DUNS number. Neil, did we miss anything here, or do you have anything to add as far as the criteria?
I do not have anything to add here. It is a fairly complete and robust list here. If you have questions about a school that is in your boundaries, whether it applies to this or not, please contact us and we can walk through the scenario and determine what the best action is.
Okay, thank you so much, Neil. So yeah, and like Neil said, if you're not sure, if you feel like you might have a private school in your boundaries, call Neil. And as far as the calculation process, how do you make your calculation of the your proportionate share calculation in Utah? Each LEA must complete the fiscal proportionate share calculation spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet must be submitted to USDE with your LEA annual IDE application. At the same time, when you do your submission, that's when you submit it. And if you want to know where that spreadsheet is located, it's in the website, and this PowerPoint slide has links to the website. Okay, we have a question here. With so many new schools showing up every year, is there a list of non-for-profit schools for the state? Great question. Do you have a list, Neil?
There is not a comprehensive list of nonprofit schools in this state, mostly because we don't have a sort of category for schools when they register their businesses as a nonprofit. So we don't maintain a list of that. As we become aware of them, we update our current list, but we don't have a reporting mechanism to be alerted when a new school opens.
Okay, thank you very much. Does it answer your question, Brent? Okay. So like I said, like the spreadsheet is located in the website, and this slide has a link to the website. And like we said earlier, we will make this slide available to you. Okay, a follow-up question. We are finding that some are non-profit for out of state, but not for in-state. Hard to determine, and yes to answer of the question. So you're finding that some non-profit for out of states, not for in-states. And it's hard to determine. Anything to say about it? Sarah, Neil?
So I'm confused. Are these schools owned, are they nonprofit schools owned by a for-profit corporation for out-of-state purposes?
He said yes.
The answer is yes. So we staffed this with our AG's office a while back, and it's a somewhat complicated answer, but essentially it says is that if the school provides all the provisions except for being a designated nonprofit, and they do not derive a significant portion of their for-profit activities for non-educational purposes, meaning that the majority of the work is for educational services that comply with the state board rule, then they would be considered a private school subject to equitable services.
Thank you so much. That's helpful. Brent, any follow-up question? Or did Neil address your concern? And just let us know in the chat. Okay, Sarah dropped something in the chat.
The National Center on Education Statistics maintains a directory of private schools. It's not always up to date. It takes them a while to get current, but I wouldn't say it's a good source for finding new ones, but it's a decent source to check and make sure you're not missing any they have on their list.
As of today, that resource is current as of 2018. So they do that survey every 2 years, and they have not published the 2020 survey yet.
Oh, so it's almost 3 years behind?
That's right. And I think that's mostly because of the pandemic and the impact it had on gathering that data.
Oh, okay. And is it updated every year normally?
Every 2 years.
Every 2 years, okay. All right. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And so in case you wonder how the private school proportionate share calculation spreadsheet look like, we just included a screenshot of that spreadsheet in this slide. And as you can see, this includes all the necessary information that you need to do your private school proportionate calculation. Just if you go back to the scenario and the example that we gave before, here you have like your child counts, the number of students in private school, the percentage, and then you apply the percentage to your total allocation to determine your proportionate share amount. And this next slide is the section, the calculation for your 611 grants. And the spreadsheet is available in the website, like I just said, in case you want to play around with it.
Yep. Anthony, one thing that is really important that I was just reminded of when I saw this slide, I'm going to go back to the slide.
Okay.
Is that sometimes there is confusion about students who receive the Carson Smith Scholarship, if they count or not, and if they are eligible for equity, if they can receive equitable services. Those students do count, and that makes that clear here. Those are still a student with a disability who the parent has chosen to go to a private school. To receive the Carson Smith Scholarship, they're still considered a child with a disability, right? They're refusing an offer of FAPE, but they're not revoking consent to be counted as a child with a disability. And so those students, because they still have a disability, are counted, and we cannot exclude them. We shouldn't exclusively be providing them to them either, but we cannot exclude them from receiving equitable services because they receive the Carson Smith Scholarship. So while that Carson Smith Scholarship is paying for their tuition at the private school, if we're providing equitable services to students with disabilities, we can't make decisions based on who's receiving Carson Smith, and they still count just like any other student in this calculation and in our decision making. I think that it's an important piece because they decline FAPE in our school district. And so then they get Carson Smith, they go to the private school, they still count as a parentally placed child. And then there's been a problem. I will say the state of Massachusetts is unique. It actually provides FAPE to these kids. They keep providing FAPE to them, but they still are parentally placed in a private school and they still get equitable services. So that's been a decision made by the US Department of Ed and reinforced recently with a finding in Massachusetts. So it's really clear we need to make sure that you would never exclude students who have the Carson Smith Scholarship from receiving equitable services and never leave them out of this calculation because they still fall in this eligible group.
Thank you so much, Sarah. A really important clarification in the context of Utah. And I feel like we should have had a slide about it.
Yeah, I didn't think about adding that, but we could definitely add some clarification, or if you have additional questions about how to count or talk about serving those kids. I know sometimes it's an awkward conversation, especially if the parents are involved, that they've just told you they don't want special ed, and then you're offering, talking to them about other services, but we need to make sure we're not excluding them.
All right, thank you so much. All right, now that we've seen how you calculate your proportionate share, so when you have a line item in your budget for private school proportionate share, then the USD will monitor you. So Neil will be checking to make sure that you're implementing and using the funds properly. And how is the monitoring being accomplished? So each LEA with Parentally Placed private school student with disabilities is monitored through the review of the LEA reimbursement request. So basically, when you will submit a reimbursement request, you're going to be asked to submit a supplemental private school expenditure report, which will show your year-to-date expenditure and rent-to-date comparison between your budget and expenditure, so that Neil, the USD staff, will be able to have a good picture of where you stand as far as your spending for private school provision. In addition to that, in the fiscal monitoring, there is a section or an indicator for monitoring private school. And we have a link here that includes the checklist of items that are checked when you will be subject to some sort of monitoring, like through a non-site visit or a desk review. Just keep in mind that you will be asked to provide some sort of documentation, proof of how you implemented private school provisions in your LEA. Next slide. Sarah, can we go to the next? Okay. And then one of the requirements for Utah is that LEAs who have identified private school within their jurisdiction should maintain information and provide upon request related to the number of students, number of parentally placed students that have been evaluated to determine if they would be eligible, the number of students that have been determined to be students with disabilities under IDEA, and then this number is determined after the consultation with the private school representative. And also, like I said, for the purpose of private school proportionate share calculation, the USD uses the counts as of December 1st in the private school. This will be the number of students with disability that have been determined to be eligible. And that number will be used to calculate the private school proportionate share requirement for next year. And also you are required to maintain the number of parentally placed private school students served during the school year. Neil, do you have anything else that you require that we missed here?
I do not believe so. I believe you covered all the applicable requirements.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any questions about your state-specific requirements? If you do, please unmute or drop your question in the chat. If not, then Sarah will take over from here to cover the next section regarding the use of funds.
Thanks, Anthony. So now we know, oh, good question. How are students identified as being eligible? These are students who have been found to be eligible by the LEA. So those students are students who potentially, there are two kind of paths into that. There may be students who attended public schools in the LEA and had an IEP and then chose to leave the public school and attend a private school, but we still know that child has a disability, even though the family again has declined our offer of FAPE and chosen to move away. The other way is through Child Find, that if we know because the parents have requested an evaluation or because the private school has notified us or some other way we find out about a student with a disability in our geographic, attending a private school in our geographic boundary, then there is an obligation of the LEA to evaluate that child. So it's likely going to be a parent referral usually. Some private schools coordinate with the district to do Child Find activities, especially those that serve younger students. But that family, again, you would find that child eligible. The district is not required to offer them FAPE and then to deny it for them to go to the private school, but the district finds them eligible. And then I would say there's an obligation, there's not an obligation by any means every year to go back and offer that family an IEP meeting, but every 3 years you would want to look to see if you needed to do a reevaluation to continue to count that child as eligible. For some students, that may be a pretty simple agreement among the team members that no additional testing is needed and the child is still considered eligible. For other students, you might want to do testing and make sure you're just not indefinitely counting those students as eligible, especially because they're counting in your amount of money that you have to spend on the private school. So probably a longer question. I noticed Kelsey said, thank you, before about a third of the way through that answer. So more than you wanted. But so now we know how much we have to spend. Let's talk about what we can spend that money on. So we know that LEAs are required to spend that proportionate share on equitable special education and related services. So it's going to be similar to what we can spend IDEA funds on, but some nuances here. And again, these services are agreed upon through meaningful consultation. So allowable use of funds. Federal IDEA funds must be expended first for students to eligible private school students. This is important because you could spend more if you want to. If for some reason you have more to spend and you want to spend more, you could do that. But you want to make sure you spend your these federal funds first to get them spent. You also have to spend them on private school kids unless you absolutely cannot. It's a pretty high bar to meet to show that you've had real meaningful consultation. What we would recommend in that case is usually if you're going to send back those funds and say the private school doesn't want us to do anything, it's best practice for the state office to check with the private school and confirm that. And so you want to make sure that happens. No Child Find activities. I think I already said that. That initial assessment to determine eligibility, if you do some sort of Child Find activity with the private school, those aren't proportionate share. That's just your Child Find obligation as a district. And if you use contracted employees to provide services, that administrative piece should not be charged against that as well. That's another important piece. Sorry, I don't know if you guys ever on Zoom, your like mouse disappears and you can like see it moving around, but not.
Hey, Sarah.
Yeah.
I'd like to translate that. So that's difficult because if your school has an indirect cost rate and you charge it against and you charge your IDA grant indirect costs, the proportionate share portion of it is not eligible for indirect costs. So you need to make note of that when you submit your reimbursement requests.
It's not eligible for indirect costs against the proportionate share amount, but would it be eligible against your general IDEA funds?
Yes,
though, right?
yes, but we need to separate that out when you do your accounting entries and not
all your indirect toward your regular IDEA
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. A few things that are important. The funds may not be used to benefit a private school. So if there are existing instructional services to eligible private school students, we can't supplant that, basically is what this is. But it also means they can't benefit a private school in that you can't just give the private school the money. You're providing services, you're providing personnel. You cannot just give the money to the private school. If you want to pay a private school professional to provide these services, you could, but it would have to be outside of their job responsibility for the private school. So you'd have to be able to show that it was something in addition. So if it's a special ed teacher that's paid by the private school, you would have to show that you're paying her extra to stay to provide tutoring after school to students with disabilities or some other service. It would have to be outside of their responsibility to the private school, because when we pay a private school teacher, that is under this part of benefiting the private school. So your public school personnel, though, sorry, that was that second bullet. I got a little bit of myself there, but the public school personnel may provide the services, and they can provide them at sites other than the public school if they're not provided by the private school, and most of them aren't. And a lot of times this looks like related services, I would say, is the time this happens the most often. And so what this is saying is that if your speech therapist is going to provide services there, speech services as part of equitable services for students in private schools, then that speech teacher could provide those services at the private school or at a separate location. Separate classes are prohibited. So you cannot create a separate class at that school. And you can't provide a separate class on the basis of school enrollment, on the basis of religion, if the classes are at the same site and the classes include both public and private school students. And I think this is really rare where you have a class that is public and private school students at the same site. But if you do that, you have to be really cautious of how you constitute those classes. Property, equipment, and supplies. These are really important as well. We often see that this is something that is an equitable service that is easier for districts to provide. So if I can provide some assistive technology, if I can provide devices those students need, those are much more predictable costs, and I can provide them and the student benefits from them all year, whereas I may be able to provide a limited number of related services or a teacher at the school throughout the year. So it's important to understand that the LEA must control and administer and the funds. They also must control and administer the supplies or equipment. And so you have to administer those things, and they're yours. They can't become the property of the private school. They may only be placed in a private school for the duration of time needed by the eligible students. We've had several questions about this one, and I've been in a discussion with OSEP about what this really means, and if it means that you can only have it there for part of the school day, if a student only needs it for part of the school day. I think I would say this isn't that narrow, and probably is referring more to making sure that they have it while they need it. And that could be for the school year. You wouldn't have to take it away every day if they didn't need it after a certain period or something. You also must ensure that they can be removed if you do purchase something without remodeling the facility. So for example, if they asked you to remodel a bathroom to make sure it was accessible, that would not be an appropriate use of these funds. And then when they're no longer needed, you have to remove them. And again, no repairs, no minor remodeling. That would include making them accessible. Most of these, if they're nonprofit, private schools are receiving some sort of federal funds anyway. And so they are responsible under the Americans with Disabilities Act to make it accessible. So you don't want to get yourself in a spot where you're making their building accessible for them. Let's talk a little bit about carryover here, that there is a provision in IDEA that if you have not expended your funds, if you don't expend those proportionate share funds in that first year of availability, so you're applying for funds soon to get your 21 funds, your FY21 funds. If after a year you have not used those that first fiscal year, you get to use them during your carryover year. So there's no incentive of like the funds revert back to regular IDEA funds if they're not spent, is what this basically is saying. That if you don't spend them in the first year, you have to keep them for that second year so they can be used for students with disabilities in private schools. Okay, I think we have a poll next, Anthony.
Yes, we do.
Okay,
All right. I'll go ahead and launch the poll.
yeah. So it's stating that funds, these proportionate share funds that we're talking about, must be both budgeted and expended from IDEA federal funds. So what this means is I have to calculate the amount like Anthony described, and then I have to use my federal funds to provide that. I can't calculate the amount and then use other funds. True or false? Okay. A couple answers coming in.
It's not moving anymore. Should we end the poll?
Yeah, I think we've slowed down enough.
Yeah. Showing the results.
Yep, so 92% true. That's correct. It is true. They have to be budgeted and expended from IDEA funds. It's not just the process of calculating amount, but we have to follow through and spend those federal funds. Okay, we have another poll, another question here. Which of the following items is an unallowable cost, or is unallowable, I guess? Provision of equipment needed by the eligible student, child find, including those assessments to determine eligibility, or paying the services of private school personnel when the services are performed outside of the regular hours of duty. Okay. We have more of a mix on this one. This is one of those that I think we have enough detail on one of them, but on our other webinars, we could have talked through why it depends on this one is the answer if we didn't have quite as much information.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should we end the poll?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Sharing the
Okay.
results.
This one we're split. Everybody understood provision of equipment needed by a student, that is allowable. Child find activities, including an assessment, that was the correct answer. You may not count child find activities or those eligibility determinations. You may not pay for them with the proportionate share funds or count that toward your proportionate share amount. The last one, and this was a bit of a trick, this is the one I was referring to that probably it depends, paying for the services of private school personnel. The answer to that would be no, except for that this includes that the services are performed outside of the regular hours of their duty at the private school, and the employee is under the supervision and control of the LEA. So the LEA is supervising those services. They're provided outside the hours of duty of the private school. So that one was a tricky one. Okay, I think we have two more, right? Anthony, for now?
One more for now.
Oh, just one more?
Yep.
Okay, materials and equipment purchased by the LEA for private school use remain the property of whom? Okay, let's close it. Okay, 92% were right that they remain the property of the LEA. We don't give ownership of that to the private school. Okay, we do
That's
have
good
one.
for now. No.
We're gonna skip this one.
Oh, do you have one more? Sorry, my bad.
Oh, yeah. There's one more question. Should we talk about it real quick?
Yep.
Okay. The LEA may provide proportionate share funds, so the funds to the private school to administer the provision of services to eligible private school students. Can I write a check to the private school and say, go ahead and provide what your kids need, use this money? Okay, Anthony, I think we're good. Let's close that poll.
Yep. Showing the results.
Yep, and 77% correct here. The funds can't benefit the private school. And as nice as this would be probably for districts, we're not allowed to just give the funds to the private school. We've got to make sure that those funds are monitored and spent by us to serve those students with disabilities, by the LEA. Okay,
Okay.
thank you. Okay, questions to consider when you're thinking about allowable cost. I'm gonna skip through some of this animation real quick. This is kind of our quick guide to what you should be thinking about as you're making decisions about allowable costs. Will the cost meet the educational and related services needs of a student with a disability? Yes, that's a pretty easy one. It's similar to our allowable cost test of is it required under the IEP for the student with a disability, but for these children, will it benefit them? I want to be clear here, those may be direct services. We talked about equipment and supplies. This also could be professional development. If you as a district, I think this is a pretty common way of using those proportionate share funds or a proportion of them. If you as a district are doing professional development for all of your teachers on something related to special education, maybe managing behavior in the classroom or applying accommodations in the general education classroom, something like that specifically applies. If it would be allowable for your teachers under IDEA, then you can use these proportionate share funds to pay that. So you could invite the private school teachers to attend your professional development and the proportion of the cost that went to provide it for them. So that proportion of teachers that attended from private schools could be an allowable cost under proportionate share. I think that's one we didn't include an example on, but that is something that we don't think of right away as equitable services, but I want to make sure everyone understands that is an allowable cost as well. Will the LEA control and administer the funds? Yes, we're great. That's important. If it includes child finder assessment, that's our biggest red flag. I would say overall across the country, that's the biggest mistake districts make, is counting those child find costs and determining eligibility of students who are in a private school as proportionate against the proportionate share amount when it may not be counted. And then if the cost will benefit the private school, if it'll benefit general ed students or finance already existing instructional services, the answer is probably going to be no. And that's again, that piece about you can't finance something they already have in place, and you you can't benefit the private school. So thank you. I think, Anthony, it's back to you now, right? I know we have about 10 minutes left and we want to quickly
do this test your knowledge. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
we'll just do it for 5 minutes and then give them time to complete the survey and we'll be good.
Okay.
All right, so yeah, now, I mean, we spoke a lot. Now it's time to test your knowledge and apply some of the contents that you learn here. And we'll just do some poll question here. Some of them are pretty much repeating what we just said earlier. So would you think if a cost is allowable, is it allowable, is it not allowable, or it depends? So the cost associated with use of private school personnel, is this cost allowable? And please let us know why you think it's a yes, no, or it depends.
If you mark it depends, maybe throw in the chat what it depends on.
Yeah. Yeah. Depends because it could, if it is outside the regular day and responsibilities of the private school staff. He is the person of the private school contract time and under supervision of the LEA. Yeah, at least you were paying attention to what we were saying. That's encouraging.
Yep. So Anthony, you want to close the poll?
Yep.
And post the
Share the
response?
results. We have 83% who say it depends. And the answer is, it depends.
Yeah.
Yep,
I think they figured out our pattern here with our questions.
exactly.
Our next one here.
Okay, the next one is, let me see, cost associated with the LEA occupational therapist providing OT services to ineligible students. Do you think it's allowable or it's not allowable? Or it depends? And again, feel free to tell us in the chats why you think one way or the other. Okay, so what do you think here? The LEA is controlling this. Yeah, it's a good one. Okay,
Should we close the poll?
close the poll and share the results.
Almost everyone's correct. It's allowable as long as the kids would benefit from them. Hopefully we're not providing them to kids who don't need them. But yeah, I think that's assumption, but yes, generally allowable.
Generally allowable. Okay, so I think we can end here. We have more practice question in the PowerPoint slide that Willie shared with you. So if you want to read more, and we also have a section that is related to common questions. It's an interesting resource for you to read on your own time if you want to know more about private school proportionate share. But for now, we wanted to give you time to complete our evaluation survey. And we'll share the link here. If you can please just complete your survey, what you think about the training today.
Yep, and we'll get these slides. Neil will post the slides. So you'll have this, like Anthony said, we have a section with common questions and answers, some additional resources.
Yeah.
And then Anthony gave you a link in the chat to a SurveyMonkey survey to help us make sure these presentations are useful to you and that we're covering things that are helpful. Anthony, do we also want to do the final poll for the people who stuck with us through the end to see if we were able to move the needle a little bit on knowledge about proportionate share?
Yep. Here it is. How would you rate your knowledge about proportionate share after this presentation?
Well, I'm going to count. Yeah, you can't all see. I'm saying that the poll responses come in. I'm not used to that. So I keep commenting on them and I know, I apologize. You can't all see that.
It'll be helpful if everybody can respond to this one. Please, begging you. Uh, 50% of the participants voted. It's not moving anymore. Give it another minute, maybe. And just remember, we are available if you need some coaching around private school, proportionate share, or any other IDEA fiscal requirements. So our contact information are included in the slides. You can contact us and then we can set up some time to go over your needs or questions that you might have. Okay, we're going to end the poll and share the results. Like Sarah, it sounds like we've made some progress.
Yeah, I think we've made great progress. We have no one in weak any longer. So anyone who felt weak has moved to at least fair, and the large majority in strong. So if you, as Anthony said, if you start to apply what you've learned today and say, oh, I don't know, now that I'm looking at this, I don't know if how we've been doing this is right, or if these funds are allowable, or if I'm counting the right students, please let us know. That I think, as Anthony mentioned, USBE has contracted with us to provide coaching to help you all prepare. So there's no risk. That's confidential. When we work with you on something, that won't be used for making findings against you or to make sure it won't affect you and increase your chance of getting an audit or anything like that, but really is intended to help you proactively make sure you're meeting IDEA fiscal requirements. So please let us know if there's anything we can do. And we have one more session, right, Anthony, next month on time and effort? Yes, we do. We have one more session on time and effort next month, and we hope that you will all come back, because time and effort is a very popular fiscal topic in federal grant management. Okay. Neil, did you have anything to say before we adjourn?
No, I do not.
All right. Thank you so very much for sticking with us until the end, and we hope to see you again next month. And feel free to sign up for a coaching session if you need some assistance from Wested. Sarah, do you have anything to say? No, that's it. Thank you, everyone. Okay. And if you haven't done it, please complete the survey. The link has been shared in the chat. I think we can just go ahead and close. End for everyone is what I do. Thanks, Anthony.